KWFM, South Tucson.
The views of this program are not necessarily those of KWFM, its management, or its sponsors. The host is solely responsible for the content.
Radio producer and a self-professed Grateful Dead fan. Host of a nationally syndicated radio show, The Grateful Dead Hour, he has oftentimes asked the musicians the questions that all of us want to ask, but also goes into the metaphysical, goes into the cosmos at times, even above the lay person's ability, or even the lay dead person's ability to really connect with the band. And I think that has to do with the intellectualism of my guest. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's been responsible for putting together the box set So Many Roads, compilation of the Grateful Dead from 65 to 95, and Postcards of the Hanging. Grateful Dead performed the songs of Bob Dylan. Some would say that the Dead played his songs better than he did. David Gans, it's an honor to welcome you to the program.
Well, thank you for having me. How can I help you today?
I wanted to ask you a little bit about you talk here about, please don't think me unsentimental. I'm quoting you. I give my eye teeth to be sentimental about the death of Jerry Garcia. But life isn't like that for me. My professional relationship with the Grateful Dead has been a challenge and a character builder. I've gotten a lifetime's worth of inspiration from Jerry Garcia. And my question is, talk about the challenges, like the nuanced challenges of dealing with these kinds of personalities. Give an example of it.
Well, you're quoting from a thing that I wrote for a Jerry Garcia tribute that was published in Dupree's Diamond News, I believe.
That's correct.
A Grateful Celebration?
That's correct.
Yeah, that was really a response to the incredible outpouring of sentiment and grief in the wake of Jerry's death. And I was still sort of emerging from... I sort of really don't think that that's the most interesting thing to be talking about, because it really... What I was talking about was the dealing with the Grateful Dead, business side, or dealing with the road crew and the people that I had to get past in order to do my job of serving the music. My relationship with Jerry Garcia was a generally pleasant one. I mean, he encouraged me and supported me in doing my work, of putting them on the radio and stuff like that. But it was during the last 10 or 15 years of Jerry's life when he had his ups and downs and going through declining periods and stuff like that, and everybody around him was dealing with this incredible the profoundly mixed feelings of being involved in this very successful band that was making millions of dollars a year while its leading light was dying before their very eyes. But the culture of the Grateful Dead was weird and difficult to traverse for years before that, because since the very beginning it was one of the most happening parties in town, and anybody who had power and territory in there was protective of it and resistant to what they perceived as intruders.
What I like about it is that as I go through my journey as a radio broadcaster, you don't grow unless you're challenged, and I just, to me, I was, especially when you first started out as a writing, I was curious as to the how, like you said, there were people that were very territorial about their positions, and how you were able to not just acquiesce them, but also be able to develop relationships with Jerry. How did you get to those guys?
Well, I started out as a journalist, and I started out as a fan first. I was a musician. I saw the Dead in '72, got interested in the Dead, started getting more involved in that music and that culture, and then I started writing for music magazines in the mid-1970s and wrote about my favorite subject as often as I could. I interviewed Bob Weir for BAM magazine in 1977, and then saw him again and interviewed him, covered his solo career and stuff, and stayed in touch with him. interviewed Robert Hunter toward the end of 1977 for BAM magazine when he was out performing a lot. And then interviewed Jerry in 1981, also for BAM magazine in collaboration with my friend and editor, Blair Jackson. So I first came to them as journalist and then got to be more friendly with them, because they recognized in me a journalist who understood what they were doing musically and could help them, explain them kind of to the world, or at least sympathize with them, And then there was, of course, the faction that didn't give a shit about being explained to the world, or saw me as something else entirely, But my relationships with the band members was predicated on my being a musician and engaging them on a level of musicianship that they didn't often encounter.
Right. A lot of the times especially conversations with the Dead, when you talk to them about their influences or the kinds of things that go on during a live performance, you guys talk to each other as musicians.
Yeah, that's the thing I was most interested in, and the thing that I always brought to the table was being able to talk to them about music making.
Like when you went to Bob Weir's house in '83 and were walking on moon boots.
Gravity boots.
Gravity boots. You had guts to get up on those things, man. I mean, that's pretty gutsy.
Huh?
That's pretty gutsy, man. It was I was cracking up, But I don't know if I don't know if I could do that.
Well, by then we'd been hanging out together quite a bit. I mean, I sort of got friendly with Bob. As I say, I interviewed him in '77 and stayed in touch with him through the whole Bob Weir band period following the release of Heaven Help the Fool and into the formation of Bobby and the Midnights. So I was a sympathetic journalist and also just would hang out with him. Bobby was a bachelor at the time, and I'd go up to the house and hang out and sometimes play around in the studio and things like that. So I had a pretty intimate relationship with him by that time, sufficient that, at that point I was working on the book that became Playing in the Band.
Right.
And Bobby was very supportive of that and agreed to give me lengthy interviews and stuff. So by that time I was asking him pretty deep stuff, and I don't remember why the gravity boots, they were there, It was just kind of fun, I think, to continue the interview while each of us took turns hanging from the ceiling.
Oh, it was, I can't imagine the amount of blood that would run into your head.
Well, that was part of the thing.
I love
gravity boots. I think that was what they were about, was, reorienting your system a little bit. I don't remember what the, philosophical underpinning of gravity boots was. It was just a goof.
I touched on it with Blair briefly, but, I know you have a relationship with Bobby, too. I was hoping you could talk about it because he had dyslexia, and I think he was misunderstood visually sometimes by people. He was very out there, and very flamboyant, and really, contorted himself a lot. But I dug that. I just know that he was also a genius. And, what were some of the ways in which Bobby lent him? Because he had to learn music. He couldn't really read music. And so I'm just curious as to the kind of things that made Bobby a genius.
Well, none of those guys except Bill Lesh read music. They were folk musicians,
right,
who learned music orally the way folk musicians did, and I don't think any of them had any formal music training besides Phil, who was deeply into it and was able to write music, on staff paper the way real composers did and stuff like that. Bobby, I think his dyslexia was the sort of thing that built his character when he was a kid, because he had to kind of bluff his way through reading and things like that. But he always had a tremendous amount of intelligence. When I interviewed Owsley Stanley in 1991, and he describes his first meeting with the Grateful Dead, he said he instantly realized that these were some of the smartest people he'd ever known. And each of them, I think the reason the band hung together as well as it did was that each of them was brilliant in his own, and so they were able to engage each other on a high level and keep each other interested, not just musically but socially as well, and that their scene was based on a concerted sense of quest and trying to change the world in some kind of meaningful way. And Weir was the youngest of them and kind of an oddball in his own way, but definitely able to hang with those people because he had the intelligence and was bent enough to keep himself interesting, like all the rest of them.
You were very apt there. The idea that intellectually they were able to challenge each other. Ironically enough, my favorite years of the Grateful Dead are from '79 to '84. The years where Brent Midland was there, and Brent was he was an anti-intellectual. He always considered himself the outsider, and nobody understood that because he seemed like he was such a good fit, hands and glove fit with the band musically. But I guess he felt like an outsider because he could never connect with them intellectually. Because the way Owsley said, obviously they were some of the smartest guys he'd ever come across, and Brent wasn't like that. But yet he filled in musically.
Well, he was hired. I think when Brent joined the band, it changed the nature of the Grateful Dead's musical presentation and narrowed it considerably. And I'm not exactly sure what the reasoning was in that. I think they were transitioning. Every personnel change in the Grateful Dead led to a stylistic evolution. Most of them, ensuring the survival of the band, but not necessarily the creative growth of the band.
Uh-huh.
Brent served their purposes very well as they transitioned into that period of playing larger arenas, serving their audience and building their audience. And the nature of the audience changed over time as well. When I was a kid, the entry point into the Grateful Dead was taking acid. In the early '70s, that's what you did. You dosed and you went and saw the Dead. I think by the time the Brent Midland era, people were coming to the Grateful Dead through a more beer-based social milieu rather than an acid one.
Or
people didn't take acid.
Right? No, I love that.
There was plenty of acid in the world, but the music I think was less propelled by LSD, and the people's apprehension of the Grateful Dead was a less psychedelic band on every level, basically.
It was, yeah, but there was a heavy infusion of coke as well.
Well, that's a problematic aspect of it. Yeah, I think from the mid-'70s on, certainly the people in the audience were doing a lot more coke, and it was assumed, and I can tell you from personal experience that plenty of people in the Grateful Dead did cocaine because I did it with them.
Right. Well, no, there are stories about, you hear from people just going backstage and there were just tubs of cocaine. For some reason, I guess in '80 and '81, it was just the purest stuff was coming in, and the band had access to it, and like you said, the Brent years epitomized by that sort of paranoid electric sound that they sound revved up. They do it feel like a stranger. It feels kind of coked up. I mean, that's just how it feels. I love it in the sense that Garcia's health was deteriorating at the same time. He really, really was not taking care of himself. And when you listen to shows, especially from '84, you really see collectively, during the moments of time in the band when they rose to the occasion, everybody was basically saying, we are going to hold Jerry up. Because he could have, it's amazing he even lived.
Well, he had an incredibly strong constitution, and it took a lot to take him down. He survived a lot of crises and general abuse and stuff like that. But it's clear from all reports, and I can tell you again as an eyewitness, that it was not just Jerry who was doing that. It was kind of everywhere in that world. But the thing about cocaine is, by the time we figured out that it wasn't our friend, it was already kind of living rent free in our minds.
Uh-huh.
And it took a little while to evict them or evict it. I haven't thought about or consumed any cocaine in 15 years, I think, and maybe longer, because that stuff is really bad for you. In the beginning, it didn't seem that way. It was just another drug in a culture that was interested in trying everything, and it did seem to kind of give everybody a little bit of a boost here and there, but eventually it started to take over and demanded more of your attention, and it's a very, very bad drug to take if what you're trying to do is merge your soul with that of another musician on stage and do something that requires a tremendous amount of emotional and spiritual collaboration.
I would like you to talk about your experiences with psychedelics, because there's this great story that I was reading here in your book, Conversations with the Dead, where you talk about you stopped taking them after you lost an argument to Garcia and a hot dog at Kezar Stadium in '73. And then, but this is the cool thing, David. You said you picked it up again in 1980 at the Warfield. You were more in control. I'd like to hear your interpretation of that.
Well, a couple of things. When I was younger, we all took way too much of it at a time. Again, from my interview with Bear that appears in Conversations with the Dead, he talked about that too, that in the beginning, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think, in the beginning, they would take maybe like 400 micrograms when it turns out that 75 would do it or something like that, that people were taking large doses of it and going farther out than they needed to. That an effective dose was lower and would, be a little bit less challenging to your peace of mind or whatever. But the thing is, I was an unformed human being. When I was younger, I was not a particularly well-adjusted person. And, they say, Ken Kesey and others would say that LSD it can't impair you directly, but what it does is sort of take whatever you are and turn it up to 11.
Right.
So if you're an unstable or an unhappy or paranoid person, it would increase your instability, your unhappiness, and your paranoia to a large degree. If you were a happy, well-adjusted person in the company of people you trusted and loved, you'd have a great time with it. I was just a young man who wasn't comfortable in his own skin and stuff, so the experiences of taking acid would very often take me off into unpleasant places, what Jerry referred to as the butt of the cosmic joke.
Right.
And I took a dose at the Kezar Stadium in 1973, and I just had an unpleasant time. I walked around the rim of the amphitheater trying to listen to the music, but just sort of caught in my own little emotional struggle, and I tried to eat this hot dog, and I just had this kind of, anxiety in my belly that made it hard to do that. And I kind of, I jokingly in that conversation said, I kept wandering around wondering why Jerry was mad at me. That wasn't really what was happening, of course, but it was just that thing. It was a generalized anxiety that was amplified tremendously by the acid I had taken. So anyway, I just stopped doing it for a long time. And then the time I was referring to in 1980, I was living in Oakland on the other side of Lake Merritt from the Henry J. Kaiser auditorium where the Dead were playing. And I told myself, the time I get in trouble is when I try and interact with people, and when your brain is going 10 times faster than your mouth, and you say something, and you try and correct it, and you get just kind of discombobulated. So I thought it would be really interesting to take some acid and not talk with people. See if I could have a pleasant time if I didn't get into a conversation that would turn into a kind of weird trap or something.
Right.
So I did. I took my dose and I walked around the lake to the venue, climbed up into a seat in the balcony, and sat there by myself and enjoyed the show. I just didn't get into conversations, so I couldn't get skid off the road as I used to do when I was younger. And that turned out, I think I remember that being a pretty pleasant night. I was never a regular acid user. I knew a lot of people who took it really frequently, and I found it really too powerful and a little scary when I was younger. In later years, I have taken it and enjoyed it tremendously because I took a moderate dose and did it in a setting where I was in control, but also because I just kind of, over the years, did the work of becoming a more fully integrated person and was less likely to be facing my anxieties and fears because I don't have anxieties and fears now on the level that I had them when I was 22.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
I feel like
when something comes to pry your brain open.
No, but I feel that in some ways I am where you were at that time. I mean, I'm not a very evolved person, but I hope to be. I hope to be where you are when you are your age. You know what I mean? But here's the question I have: is like, can you talk a little bit about Garcia's his sardonic wit and his idea, just the immense knowledge that this guy had, but yet he still had trouble making decisions, and he never wanted to be the de facto. He was the leader, but he didn't want to be.
I think that's a slightly inaccurate
Go ahead.
characterization. He was as brilliant a person as you ever would know, and he read and watched movies and watched TV and engaged with the world and packed a huge amount of it into his mind and his soul. And he was incredibly articulate, but I think in a lot of ways was a little bit lacking in some self-awareness or lacking in some self-control or something. And I think he just was sort of pathologically unwilling to wield the authority that he commanded, because he never wanted to be like telling anybody else what to do. One of the organizing principles of the whole Grateful Dead and hippie community and stuff in the Haight-Ashbury days was they wanted to live what Jerry referred to as an uncluttered life and pursue music and live in a more peaceful world and stuff like that. Well, the experiment failed when the neighborhood was overrun with seekers who had no freaking idea what they were supposed to be doing there, and the city wasn't prepared to handle the influx of kids in the Summer of Love and all this other stuff. And soon, the junkies and the dealers and the thugs and the opportunists came and drove everybody out of that neighborhood. The Grateful Dead carried that idea of communal culture with them out into the world and brought that out, to their gigs and built their community in a place with no physical center, because the Deadhead community followed them on the road.
Right.
And, formed itself around the music. And Jerry, as the focus of that community, because he was the focus of the music and because of his undeniable charisma, commanded this authority and soon realized that everything he said was being taken way too seriously, and so he stopped talking on stage so much and just started being more careful about how he presented himself and stuff. But he was always a guy who could engage you on any level and was interested in other people, was never just going to sit around and talk about himself and blather on about BS like so many rock stars did, because he was much more interested in what was going on around him. I'm sure as a journalist you've had this experience, which I've had many times, of sitting down with somebody to do an interview and finding out that they weren't obsessed with their own thing and that they were perfectly willing to talk about other stuff. Jerry was the easiest guy in the world to interview if you just wanted to have a general conversation with him. And if you came to him with focused questions about a specific thing, he would answer them, also with
Right. No, I mean it's.
But sometimes I remember sitting down with other musicians who were just like you couldn't get them to talk about anything but their message points, and you might as well have been reading questions off a list, a questionnaire and stuff, and they just stuck to their own stuff. Jerry was Randy Newman is another one like that. It was just interviewing was just so much fun.
What caught my attention there was this idea that Garcia, the idea of saying, "Oh my God, my whatever I'm saying is I'm either looked at as a god or people are taking me way too seriously, so I actually have to become more enclosed." And it's true. I mean, he stopped being a spokesman on stage. He was always unfailingly courteous to his people that loved him when they'd stop him in the hotels and talk to him. But at the core, he kind of wanted to protect him. He had to protect himself, and that must have been a challenge for him.
I think he, over time, became weary of being that figurehead, and didn't want the responsibility of it. I think he carried it well, and in the early days, in particular, was kind of a charismatic figure and a leader in that community when they really needed somebody who can articulate things. But later, the tail began to wag the dog in the Grateful Dead world, and the band was taken so seriously by so many people, and they sort of projected so much onto the Dead, and in the later years, they were just a bunch of musicians trying to get to the next gig, and probably were a little uncomfortable with the intensity of the devotion and the size and nature of the community that sprang up around them.
They were. You say they were overwhelmed, or they felt.
I think they were at times, and toward the end. I mean, that summer of 1995, when there were people rioting in the parking lot and tearing down the tents at Deer Creek and coming into the show, I think they realized that a significant portion of their following had no idea what they were really about, and were there for this anarchy, this party, this unsupervised floating commune or whatever. And I think they were really starting to wonder if it was a good idea to continue. I mean, they were making vast amounts of money, but they were playing for audiences that didn't really, didn't share their history and didn't really comprehend the depth of the music they were making. And the music they were making became less deep over time as well, which was both a cause and an effect of that phenomenon.
No, that's very well said. The Jamaican World Music Festival in 1982, that provided a major impetus for you. Was that the catalyst for you to write Playing in the Band?
It only in the sense that it was where I met Peter Simon and Bob Miller.
Can you talk a little bit? Talk about that.
On a press junket covering the festival, and they put the journalists up in this luxury hotel called the Trial Beach and Country Club. And hanging out there by the pool, I met Peter Simon, who's a legendary photographer. Did Reggae Bloodlines, I think, with Stephen Davis and some other books, and was working on a book about the dead. And he was there with his editor, Bob Miller, at then was St. Martin's Press. And I just met them and schmoozed them up, and I thought, I made friends with them and asked Peter if he might be interested in looking at some of my photos and things like that. And I stayed in touch with them. And for some reason, somehow, during 1983, the writer that Peter was working with left the project, and they called me and asked me if I'd be interested in taking over responsibility for the text.
Wow.
And, of course, I was. So Jamaica was the place where I met my collaborator, but
right.
Aside from that, it wasn't really it wasn't anything that happened in Jamaica other than meeting Peter that led to that.
But yet, at the same time, so the person that was writing the text for that book dropped, and then you came in there and Playing in the Band. I spent years analyzing that book, mainly because the photo that was taken on the front was this incredible picture, like Route 66, a big motorcycle, and there's the band in the depths, deep in the depths of 1984.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at that photograph, and I don't think it's a shadow. I think Brent has a black eye.
Yes, he does.
Looking at the band, they look like they're approaching a 20-year anniversary, and I was just wondering, looking back, because I know the text of it spanned years before that, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about how it was, that the timing of that book and the kind of the mood collectively that the guys were in, and were they still looking to the future, and what were they looking to?
At that point, I think they were. Again, I was sort of fairly closely involved with various band members. I had become friendly with Phil Lesh by that time too, and he was quite supportive. I think they were feeling, at least the guys that I was intimate with, I didn't really have much of a relationship with Kreutzmann at the time. Jerry was friendly enough, but fairly isolated from everybody at that time. Mickey Hart, I certainly was friendly enough with, and Brent was friendly enough to me, but my main contacts in the band were Phil and Bob. And I sense was that they felt there was, it was an ongoing thing, and they were happy to continue to do it. But, their creativity had slowed down considerably. They weren't writing very many songs in that time. They had brought some new songs out in 1982 that didn't get recorded until 1987 for various reasons, a lot of which had to do with the pharmaceuticals,
Well, they couldn't stay in the studio for more than 10 minutes.
That's certainly seems to have been the case for one or two band members. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean it was like and when you look at it, how the irony of it, where Touch of Grey, which was sort of in its infancy in '82 and '83, turns out to be the mega hit that the band scored on in '87 because it was a little bit more polished and developed on MTV. I find that to be incredibly ironic.
Well, they weren't in a place to record. They tried to go into the studio. They went to Fantasy Studios in Berkeley in 1984, I think it was, or maybe late '83, and set up all their stuff and started trying to record, but nothing came of it for various reasons, and they kind of abandoned it for a while because that was right then when Jerry's health went on its roller coaster ride, you know. When they emerged from that at the end of '86, Jerry was much healthier, and they were ready to start doing stuff again. That's when they went to work on the album that became In the Dark, and that song turned out to be a really nice celebration of Jerry's resurrection. You know, the seed had been planted 5 years previous, but the fruition of it came at that moment of sort of a renewed vitality in Jerry and therefore in the whole band, and they were rehearsing to do that tour with Bob Dylan, which was a whole other kind of, you know, set of ups and downs. But you know, they had this great material and delivered a really nice album and had a record company. It was also, remember, in that time there was this sort of stretch of bands that had been like regional monsters that suddenly had breakthrough hits. REO Speedwagon, they've been in the trenches in Champaign, Illinois for, 10, 15 years, and all of a sudden they had this gigantic breakout hit, Keep On Loving You, you know. And I think I have a sense that there were several other bands, and it was, in a way, it might have been kind of, okay, well, it's the Grateful Dead's turn to have that happen to them. The world was ready for them. Clive Davis was the head of their record label, and he had tons of pull. And the revival of Jerry, I think, was a great story hook, you know. And plus they made this wonderful record.
Can you talk about John Perry Barlow a little bit? He was the head of the Wyoming, if I'm correct, the Wyoming Republican National Committee or something like that. And he also was this very prodigious collaborator with Weir, and talk a little bit about what he brought to the band and sort of the idea of an intellectualism without academia kind of philosophy.
Well, Barlow was a high school buddy of Bobby's. They met in boarding school in Colorado when they were kids and stayed friends. Barlow was, I believe he studied theology at Connecticut. What school was that? Wesleyan.
Wesleyan, yeah.
And he was a poet. And so when Weir's relationship with Hunter sort of went sour, Barlow was there to contribute some lyrics, and they collaborated on some really, really wonderful songs. And Barlow, I didn't meet Barlow until November of 1982, and had a fairly pleasant and friendly relationship. I interviewed him in Jamaica in 1986.
Yeah.
When early in the days of my time in cyberspace, I and some friends had started a Grateful Dead conference on The Well, which is an early online community. And I was touting it to Barlow, and I remember him saying, he wasn't sure he wanted to be part of anything that required you to have a handle. He was kind of making fun of it. And a few years later, he was the freaking Lord Mayor of cyberspace.
It's unbelievable.
He got into it in a major way and ended up becoming a very significant figure in the advancement of online citizenship, which he continues to be to this day.
Yeah, there was this idea that between Garcia and guys like Barlow and Weir, very bright guys, wound up going to boarding schools and they were self-educated. So it was not like they didn't have to pay for it. It wasn't a pay-to-play system. You could still educate yourself. Scholars
in that sense, but they were all students of life, and they were all participants, active participants in many, many cultures. Barlow, I think he graduated from Wesleyan. But he was the son of a Republican politician in Wyoming and wound up taking over responsibility for the family's ranch later in his life. I don't know what the disposition of that was. I don't think he still owns the ranch, but these were all smart people, and they were well-read people, and they were interested in culture on many, many levels, but not in the academic way of publishing or footnoting or paying attention to, trends in academic life or whatever. They were just out in it, living it every day, and thinking about it and talking about it, and very articulate about it. Barlow was one of those. Hunter, much more reclusive, doesn't get out much, but certainly pays attention to what's going on in the world. And so, this was just it was a fraternity, a brotherhood of really, really smart and soulful people who cared about what was going on in the world and had made a heroic attempt to change that world at some point, and then just had to figure out how to live in it and keep some of their principles alive after the idealism of the 60s was savaged.
Non-academia intellectualism, the guys who cared about the world, that is non-existent in our culture now. If you don't have an education, you're just kind of ignorant. This to me was a very unique time in history. And you were there as a journalist, and I can't imagine what it must have been like to cover it. I was hoping you could just, if you were aware of it at that time. I know you were an evolving person at that time, but what was it like as a journalist to be covering one of the more intense intellectual times in our history?
Oh, I think when I became a journalist, it was to cover music, and I never studied journalism except in junior high school, and never functioned as a proper journalist per se in any kind of mainstream way. So I really was more interested in furthering my own ambitions of learning about and making connections in the music world. So journalism to me was an opportunity to educate myself and, for the furtherance of my own creative aims. It turned out to be a decent living for 10 years and led to another decent living doing radio. But I don't think I've ever been a journalist in the formal sense of the word. I wrote for music magazines and certainly have developed many skills as an interviewer. But I was really, like the Grateful Dead, doing it on instinct and developing my own methods from trial and error. So I'm not sure I can answer the question coherently.
I was
or
reading,
maybe I just did.
I think you did. No, reading some. I don't know where this was from, but somebody asked you your favorite years of the Dead, and I think you mentioned 74, maybe 77, and then you said maybe 81. And I want you to take the maybe out of there and make an argument that 81 was one of the best years for the Grateful Dead.
On what basis?
I just want to hear you. I read it from you last night. You said maybe 81.
Well, from the perspective of 2012, I don't think I would nominate 81 as a peak year. I think that the Grateful Dead let's start that over. The Grateful Dead were different bands over the course of their career collectively. And I think that's one of the, that accounts in part for their longevity, was that they kept themselves interested jointly and separately and challenged each other and continued to build their audience by continuing to deliver honest performances. But I think their peak creative years were the late 60s and early 70s, and I think 1981 was a year in which they were solid. Brent Midland was certainly up to speed and in the mix, and they had become very, very proficient at that somewhat narrower definition of what the Grateful Dead were than previous. I'm writing a book about this right now, so I'm thinking about this stuff constantly. And every time I have a conversation like this, it helps me focus my ideas. So thank you for that.
Well, no. First of all, time out for a second. Can you talk? Can you? Do you? I wanted to ask you about this. The narrowing of the sound. You're saying they became more limited in their sound, and can you talk about how they got narrow? Because in '78, it seemed to me Keith was dead weight at that point.
Yes, that's true.
So, but I mean, so talk about the narrowing of the sound.
Over the course of 1978, Keith became less and less engaged, and the advent of the drums and space structure of the second set, I think, also became a limiting factor in the creativity of the Dead, because it sort of began to corral their improvisation into fixed locations rather than having any in every song be a potential locus of invention. When Brent joined the band, because Keith had already checked out, the phenomenal creativity of 1973 and 1974, had to do with Keith being fully engaged, Jerry being at the peak of his powers, Bobby being at the peak of his power. Everybody was like firing on all cylinders, and the band was just doing great. They were actually beginning to evolve in a musical direction that might have taken them somewhat out of. This is a really tough question, because Jerry said, in '74 they were starting to go off in musical directions and thought they were leaving their audiences behind routinely. Bobby said something similar. I disagreed with him, but then I was one of the more musical audience members who was really interested in those explorations. When they came back in '76, they had new songs. They had Mickey Hart back in the band, but Keith was still very much alive and very much engaged, and they were still covering a lot of ground, although there were fewer opportunities for just pure exploration and improvisation. By '78, Keith was falling out, as we have said.
Yeah.
And then when Brent joined the band, they had to reshape their repertoire to accommodate his skill set. And it meant a little bit less of the free sort of jazz-flavored improvisations of 1973, and more blues rock and arena rock kind of stuff, because that's where Brent came from. He came from the Los Angeles music scene, played the Hammond organ, played a little bit of synthesizer, and played electric piano very well. But he was a more mainstream, FM rock kind of player.
Right.
Whereas Keith had come from the classical and jazz worlds. What I noticed, if you look at the set list, Bobby started abandoning his own original material. What I'm looking at on the 1981 set list is, why in the world do I have to listen to Bob Weir sing C.C. Rider when he could be singing Black-Throated Wind?
No, they didn't do any Black-Throated Winds in '81.
C.C. Rider is adding nothing to the world's knowledge of that tune. It's just a hoary blues tune that's been done too many times, and Bobby is not a great blues singer, and would you please do something cooler?
Well, I was also going to say they took 2 trips to Europe in '81, which is pretty prodigious. And to me, I mean, there's a great for someone who actually never saw the Dead before. For me, it's just through video. I get to see this show from Germany in 1981. It looks like I mean, they and the Who were playing, and the general tenor of the band seemed to be upbeat, and it didn't have that appearance of sort of people seem to you're right, the peak year 73 74 they were in prime mode, but it seemed to me there was a little bit of a spark and rebirth. And I would argue, I agree, Brent is at the core a blues rock guy, but he did come in to me when I listened to some of that '79 stuff, especially. He provided some of that Chick Corea style jazz on his keyboards.
Yes, he did. There are shows from the fall of '79 that open up in surprising places.
Exactly.
It's very clear that Brent is getting up to speed and that they're starting to explore. But something happened to narrow that down again, because you don't hear that in 1980. The session, they played those 2 long runs of shows in San Francisco and New York, and they recorded all of them for a live album. And there's a surprisingly a surprising lack of adventure in those performances. I think they were conscious of the fact that they were recording and were not being as daring as they might have been otherwise. And I think that kind of thing is once you limit the travel of your hinge, the door will never open that far again. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, I don't know.
I think 81. They played well, and I'm not saying that they weren't good, but it wasn't as exploratory and as even that fall of '79, which had these isolated moments of amazingness. And they were settling into a stretch of being a more conventional band that, and don't get me wrong, a conventional band that was able to play, incredibly sweet and quiet ballads in front of audiences of 20,000 people, and play unstructured music, for stretches of several minutes at a time,
right,
in front of those same audiences without getting, kicked out of the room. But it was less adventurous, less exploratory, less creative than the stuff they had been doing just a few years earlier.
In 81, the interesting thing, they would throw some songs, some first set songs into the second sets, Bird Song or The Music Never Stopped, traditionally first set tunes. They put them into the second set. They were still playing these sort of shed fields. In your mind, in my mind, the crushing of the 60s began with the university college campuses no longer allowing the Dead to play on those campuses. I was curious as to your thoughts, but 83 was essentially the last year they played at universities.
Well, they played on the college campus at University of California until 1989, and they played at Stanford in 85.
Yeah, I mean outside of California, though, UVM.
I can't answer that because I don't know. I have a feeling it had more to do with the size of the venues than with anything to do with campuses per se banning them. They moved to civic arenas, which tended to be larger than the college gyms they were playing in earlier years. But if there's some information about a change, if the universities all decided to not let the Dead play anymore, it's news to me.
No,
But let's get back to something else he said. That whole notion of first set songs.
Yes.
That right there is an example of what I was talking about, the narrowing of the thing. The
right.
Settling of the Grateful Dead presentation into such predictable structures was really an unfortunate thing that happened over time. The idea that The Music Never Stopped was traditionally a first set song, how did it become traditionally a first set song? Why was it only used at the end of, why did they only get to a point where they were only playing one more Saturday night on a Saturday night, for Christ's sake? Why would they only do...
Right.
Why songs became, they settled into a particular place, and it became unusual if the song turned up someplace else. And that was a hardening of their performance into, structures and conventions that took creative opportunities away. Phil told me many times in interviews he thought that any song should be able to open up at any time, which used to be what happened, and everybody's reading of a song could vary from night to night, and the singer would be in a different mood, or the guitar player would play different licks and stuff like that, but things became much more regularized, and songs began to fit into specific places. I remember sitting in the balcony of the San Francisco Civic Auditorium with my friend Marty, and I think it must have been January of '87, one of those shows. And whatever they were playing coming out of the drums, he and I looked at each other and went, it's going to be this, 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 and this. And we knew what the rest of the show was going to be as soon as they played that one song, because things had become that formalized in the Grateful Dead. And that was a heartbreaking moment for me, in the sense that I really felt that they had ceased to be the anything can happen kind of band. Now, along with that, I had to look around and realize that they were pleasing 8,000 people around me, pretty much.
Right.
And they were making a good living doing what they were doing.
Right.
And that my failure to love what they were doing now was more my problem than theirs.
Absolutely. I know they failed collectively to challenge the status quo, but who would have been that person? Nobody in the band pushed the envelope and said, no, we're not going to just play these garden variety tunes. Didn't seem that anybody wanted to push Garcia on that, or nobody was challenging at that point, and therefore you had this.
It's hard to know because Phil complained about it and thought that, he told me on various occasions, well, when we come back, we're going to restructure things, why not start a show with space or whatever, well, it very rarely happened. Those things were as rare as hen's teeth because for one reason or another, and collectively, they did not have the will to challenge it, and I think it had a certain amount to do with just that they were doing well, doing what they were doing, and that they didn't want to risk confusing their audience too much. Now, I was of the number of people who would have loved any kind of upset in the routine and welcomed it and been really, really happy and encouraging of it. But I think by the time that we're talking about here, the majority of fans had come up hearing the Dead in this much more rigid structure and would have been confused and even dismayed by it. When I talk with younger Deadheads, that the notion when they say something like a second set song, it's like, well, it didn't used to be that way.
Right.
They opened the show with Morning Dew a lot, 69, It didn't have to be that moment of gravitas at the end of the second set, which was either, followed by Sugar Magnolia or Not Fade Away, or on some occasions was the last song they play in a set. It had to do, more with the running time of the show and things like that, because the band had sort of settled in. Yeah,
you're right. No, it's really. I'm absorbing this, and that being said, even for all its structure, there was something about the vulnerability of the group at that time that just cries out for more recognition, which is what I try to do. When you started at KFOG in 1984, what was the first, if you even remember, what was your idea going into the Grateful Dead Hour? What was that first show like? What songs did you...
well, I didn't start the Grateful Dead Hour. The KFOG Deadhead Hour was begun in 1984 by its then program director, Dave Logan. I appeared on the KFOG Deadhead Hour as a guest on February 18th, 1985 to promote my book. And I produced for them. I had collected all this wonderful interview material about the song Greatest Story Ever Told. And I had Bob Hunter and Mickey Hart and Bob Weir all talking about how that song evolved. And Mickey Hart, God love him, took me up to his studio and got the master tapes out of Rolling Thunder and played for me the tracks from which that song was built.
Wow.
It began with a recording of a pump on his property,
right,
to which was added a track of log drums that had a certain pitch and pattern to them. And then he gave that to Bobby and said, write a song around this. And Bobby wrote a song which became the pump song, which then became Greatest Story Ever Told. I produced that segment and then played a couple of cool versions of Greatest Story Ever Told and rounded out the hour with a couple of other cool things. I think it was a Satisfaction encore from the Frost Amphitheater. I sort of just came to it because I had the tapes, and it was a lot of fun, and I wanted to promote my book, and I had all this knowledge about Grateful Dead music. And the guy who was hosting the show was a wonderful fellow by the name of M. Dung.
How do you spell that?
D-U-N-G, exactly like it sounds. A wonderful fellow, a Michigander who had been in San Francisco for a while, and it wasn't really a Deadhead. And he was also doing this specialty program called the Sunday Night Idiot Show, and he was the morning drive weekend jock, weekday jock, which, as you probably know, is just an incredibly punishing shift if you're somebody who'd rather be out till 3 in the morning at rock and roll shows.
Right.
So he was very happy to have me and a couple other local Deadheads helping him provide the music for the show. And I just got really, really into it, and I had so much fun putting music together for the show and starting to do little audio montages, cutting tape and stuff like that, that eventually the station management asked me to take over responsibility for the show so that M could go back to his, other tremendously time-consuming gigs, which I happily did. And then I got a call from WHCN in Hartford asking if they could carry my show too. And I said, oh, that sounds like fun. Then WNEW called, which at that time was the biggest rock and roll station, in the world. So I went to, and then a station in San Diego asked me. So I went to the Grateful Dead organization and asked if they'd be interested in allowing me to syndicate the program. And they said yes. Jerry was very encouraging about it. John McIntyre, who was managing at the time, was very supportive. And I went to a meeting and sat down with all those guys and told them what the deal was. And they said, this sounds like fun. Go for it. So without ever planning to, I wound up, doing this for a living.
Yeah, that's always how it works, though,
Yes. Well, I consider myself a student of the Grateful Dead in that I have lived an improvised life. I have followed my nose, my inspirations, and been smart enough to recognize a door when it opened in front of me, but never really made a plan. I just did what made sense, tried to maintain some integrity and, serve the music and be honest and decent to people, and it all just opened up in front of me, and I followed it.
Can I just have one follow up on this? This 82 Satisfaction, or you guys were using analog cassette tapes to play them?
Oh yeah.
So what if you got like a 4th generation soundboard? I mean, that's the way it was coming out on this. I mean, were you able to access the vaults right away?
I actually was able to go into the vault pretty quickly once they agreed to let me do the show. This was before Dick Latvala had been hired to run the vault. And there was a old friend of the Dead's named Willie Legate, who goes back to the very early days of Palo Alto, who was kind of the keeper of things, and he just let me in, and asked me to keep a list of what I had taken. But I just went in there and made copies of things and took them away. But I also had access to really good tapes from outside. By that time, there were plenty of people trading good tapes, and I knew several of the sort of legendary tapers, including most notably a fellow named Bob Menke, who was...
Yeah, I know that name.
Also, Bob had access to lots of tapes and soundboard tapes and things like that. So I was well enough connected to be able to get good quality music, and that's one of the things, the band knew that I was a musician and that I had a decent ear and that I wasn't going to put, crappy sounding or poor performances on the air. So they trusted me, and Phil at one point explicitly said to me, look, you don't have to ask me for permission about a specific thing. We trust you. Just do it. It'll be fine.
But no, that's fantastic. But were you able to get, like, now you have clear perspective on like 73, 74, and at that time, how were you able to really evaluate their historical trajectory, and how did you peruse that? How did you break that stuff up, and how did you know that it was good stuff?
I'm a musician who knows that music inside and out. I think I know that music as well as anybody who isn't actually in the band. From having played that kind of music for 40 years now, from having conversed with the band members about the music for many, many years, and from having listened to hours and hours and hours of it and having seen it live. I mean, I was definitely qualified for the job because I was a scholar of it. Again, a completely appointed scholar, but a scholar nonetheless.
It wasn't that, though, you felt an obligation to play what the band was currently playing only, exclusively. It was already historical. It was one of the first historical music shows, or... I
have no idea. But, yeah, it was, getting current stuff was actually kind of difficult because Dan Healy was such a bitch about it. the Grateful Dead sound guy was also a radio man, and he was never particularly interested in supporting or allowing me to get what I wanted. So I had to work around some of the great interferers in the Grateful Dead world. Fortunately, I knew other people who were connected and could get recordings from them, but Healy himself went out of his way to make it difficult for me. But I had access to tapes, and I always did a mix of archival and current stuff. It was always, if I had something fresh from the current tour, I'd play some of that, and then I'd play something from 1970, and then new tapes would surface. Nowadays, there's, everything's on the archive, but in those days, suddenly a little trove of tapes, some roadie would give cassettes to a friend who'd make copies, and things like that. So tapes were always being unearthed, plus I was able to go into the vault from time to time and grab things from history. So I just made it my principle in running the show to deal with what's current and deal with the best of history and mix things up and not just favor my own favorite eras, but also play stuff that other people had asked about or recommended, and just keep it, keep a nice healthy mix of current and historic material.
We're talking with David Gans. David, one final question for you, and I appreciate you taking the time. But I'm interviewing the great baritone sax player and tuba player Howard Johnson tomorrow, and I was reading on your blog about Levon Helm and his passing and the impact that he had on music and on humanity. And I was wondering, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about what you felt his impact was on music, and also the contributions that the band itself, the impact the band had on the Grateful Dead's music.
Well, I think the band, the music from Big Pink album, I think was a huge signal that it was not only okay but desirable to quiet down and look backwards and make music that was respectful of traditional American forms after the sort of psychedelic explorations of the late, of the immediately preceding era. I've been reading a lot about that stuff. Greil Marcus and Michael Gilmore both have suggested in their writings that the events at Altamont Speedway kind of sobered everybody up a little bit and made them realize that maybe living out on the psychedelic edge and pushing things as far as they could in that direction might not be a long-term survival strategy. And John Wesley Harding and music from Big Pink were huge successes in the culture and on the charts. Well, actually, I don't think music from Big Pink was a huge success on the charts, but certainly The Wait was a hit single with everybody in the world. And I think Robert Hunter and Jerry Garcia and their colleagues all looked at that and went, wow, this is the kind of stuff we love. This is what we came up doing.
Right.
Maybe we don't have to risk our sanity every freaking night going out to the edge of the universe. Let's get those acoustics out. And Jerry had started playing pedal steel at that point. So I think Levon, and another thing about the band was that they were all unconventional singers who made an absolutely phenomenal blend. That Rick Danko's voice and Richard Manuel's voice and Levon Helm's voice individually were amazing instruments, each rough-hewn and, and unique in its own way. And the blend of the three was something else entirely that was just a knockout. And
absolutely.
I think the Dead had, through their friendship with Crosby, Stills, and Nash, had looked at the idea of getting more into singing, and they saw from those guys that it was possible to, make a unique blend of unconventional voices. And then just the songwriting, the sort of, the irony that this Canadian was writing some of the greatest American songs you ever heard. I think Hunter was just ready to jump on that bus, man. So Levon was, and the band were an inspiration to the Grateful Dead directly to, return to their Americana roots and look at country music and folk music and classic rock and roll as inspirations instead of just trying to, be some weird combination of Cecil Taylor and Salvador Dali.
A Canadian writing about Americana. That's a great line. Could you just, before we go, talk a little bit about this book that you, or this, maybe it's the different eras of Dead music you were talking about? You're writing a book right now?
Well, it's basically going to be a critical history of the Grateful Dead and an opinionated listening guide. It doesn't have a title yet, and I'm still doping out the structure of it. But essentially what I was asked to do was a book that I'm uniquely suited to do, which is to talk about how music was made in the Grateful Dead, how that music changed over time, who the people were that made it, and how to listen to it. So I'm going to come up with like a fantasy set list that you could actually, listen to these songs in a row and get the evolution of the Grateful Dead. And there'll be lots of little sidebars and boxed items, like you can't just pick one dark star, There's going to have to be like, here's 12 dark stars that might give you a notion of the range of that tune over the years.
Right.
And talk about, the improvisational vehicles and the consistent greatness of their songwriting to the very, very end, and things like that. So it's going to be kind of I don't think it's going to be a weighty, deep treatise with narratives and footnotes and stuff. I think there will be an essay on the musical history of the band, the evolution of it, and the factors that went into those changes, many of which we just were talking about. And then an annotated listening guide, along with the disclaimer that says, look, this is just one man's opinion. It's one well-informed opinion, but it is only one opinion, and I know 10 guys who could give you a different and equally valid list.
No, that's the best way to put it. You put your stuff out there, you let other people chime in, and you get a communal response, just as you said the Grateful Dead community was and remains today. David Gans, I thank you so much for taking the time. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. I will speak to you soon.
Okay, thanks.
Take care now.